So there we go. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And this will be a 1-hour conversation, more or less, organized by the Finance and Humanity Village in the context of the economy of Francesco. Very briefly, for those who might not be familiar, the economy of Francesco
there we go. Good morning and good
is
afternoon,
an international event convened by Pope Francis, let's say targeting specifically to young economists with the aim to formulate ways forward to better shape today's economy in a more equitable and sustainable way. This is actually the second webinar we organize as a village in the context, in the field of public finance. And I'm sure it will provide interesting insights and food for thoughts for all of us. We actually had, as I said, another webinar a couple of months back on this issue. So let's say we want to keep this fil rouge in the field of public finance. As always, we will have a main speaker, an expert in the field, and there will be also room for questions and comments afterwards. So please, everyone, feel free to raise comments and questions either on Zoom or YouTube. Today, in particular, the topic is the future of the debt crisis, with a particular focus on developing countries. No need to say that this is a topic of extremely relevance and a very debated topic, I would say. We have all followed and read about the measures implemented so far by the international community, initiative of debt standstill, debt relief. So we are all looking forward to know more about this. I think I can stop here without any further delay. I will now give the floor to Enrico Nano from the organizing committee. Enrico is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and he will introduce our main speaker and will moderate the discussion. So Enrico, you have the floor.
Thank you, Martina. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ugo Panizza, who is indeed a professor of international economics and Pictet Chair in Finance and Development at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And he's also Vice President of CEPR, which is the Center for Economic Policy Research. And before joining the Graduate Institute, he was the head of the Debt and Finance Analysis Unit at UNCTAD. So clearly an expert of the topic today, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce him, also being a student of him at the Graduate Institute. And I will now leave the floor to our speaker for his presentation, and afterwards we will move to the Q&A session. Professor Panizza, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Martina. Thanks, Enrico, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Too bad my mom doesn't understand English, because she would be very happy to know that I'm doing something which is linked to the Pope. So, okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, share. It's not letting me share my screen. Share screen. Yeah, I want to share this screen. Okay, can you all see the screen? Please let me know.
Yes.
I assume you can. Fantastic. So I call this life and debt, which is sort of a play of word on life and debt. So this is partly based on joint work with Patrick Bolton, who is a professor at Columbia University, Lee Buchheit, who is probably the biggest expert, legal expert in debt restructuring in the world. Is the guy who basically restructured the debt of every country, from Argentina to multiple times to Ecuador to Greece. Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, who is a professor at Berkeley. Mitu Gulati, who is a law professor at Duke, Chantai She, who is a professor at University of Chicago, and Beatriz Veller Di Mauro, who is my colleague at the Graduate Institute, and she's also the president of CEPR. So let me start with some shameless advertising. If you're interested in this topic, I often tweet at this Twitter handle. So if you want to follow there, you can. So, but let me get into the talk. So this is a massive economic crisis. Let me spend a couple of minutes talking about this graph. This graph shows two types of figures. On the horizontal axis, it has the forecast for GDP growth for all the countries in the world that was done in October 2019, so just before the COVID crisis. And on the vertical axis, it has the most recent forecast. These are IMF forecasts, which was done just last week. So let me take one country to illustrate this graph. So it's India. This country, the country you see there is India. So in October 2019, the IMF expected India to grow during the year 2020 at about 5.6%. This is the growth rate in income per capita. So the average Indian would get 5.6% richer during 2020, according to this expectation about the IMF. Just to give you an idea what 5.6% means, growth rate, it means that income per capita would double every 13 years. So that's what 5.6% would mean. In the most recent forecast, India is expected to grow this year, to contract by 5.5%. So an 11% change in income per capita growth in the period of a little bit more than 6 months. This is huge. Here I talked about India. Here you have all the countries in the world with their various symbols. This red line is basically a 45-degree line. If a country were to be above the line, this would be a country which is now expected to grow at a faster rate than it was expected to grow 6 months ago. If a country were to be on the line, this country would be expected to grow at exactly the same rate in which it was expected to grow 6 months ago. If it's below the line, it's a country like India, which is now expected to grow at a slower rate than what it was expected 6 months ago. As you can see, there is no country on the line or above the line. So this is a global recession that affects all countries. Moreover, countries which are to the right of this vertical line were countries which were expected to have a positive growth rate 6 months ago. And there were 160 countries. So 6 months ago, we thought that there would be 160 countries in the world which would have a growth in income per capita. Countries above this horizontal line are countries which are now expected to have a positive growth. There are 7 countries. So this is massive. This is the biggest recession and the most globalized recession that we have on record. If we think about the last global crisis, which was the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, we would have here on this upper corner about 70 countries. So now we have 7. So this is really a massive economic crisis. So I will talk about that, but let me, since I started with shameless promotion, self-promotion, before doing that, let me just show you something else. So there are a few countries, so I highlighted them here. This is Mauritius, this is Maldives, this is St. Lucia, this is Fiji. So these are countries which actually had a relatively small number of COVID-19 cases. But look at the economic impact of the crisis. Maldives was supposed to grow at a 4% rate. It's now supposed to contract at 12%. So it's massive. Same thing for Mauritius, Fiji, Sri Lanka. So these are clearly countries that, even though they have not been affected directly by the pandemic through a high degree of infection, they're suffering a massive economic price for it, because these are countries that mostly live on tourism, and the crisis had a massive negative impact on global tourism. So I will spend most of the time to talk about that, but let me use a couple of seconds to continue with self-promotion. So we just issued an ebook. It just came out on Monday, which I did with Simon Jankov of the London School of Economics. And this is an ebook which talks about the economic effect of COVID-19 in developing economies. It talks about that, but it talks about many other issues as well. And this is a free book. You can just click on that link or go on the CEPR or VoxU website and get it for free. Okay, so now let me stop with shameless self-promotion. This is a graph that I didn't do. I took this graph from a report of the rating agency Standard & Poor's, and it shows what's the share of government revenues which some low and middle income countries are spending to pay interest on their public debt. Look at the case of Nigeria. More than 50% of government revenues are right now used to pay interest. Same thing in Ghana, Angola and Egypt, it's 45%, Zambia 30%. So these are a huge number. So I mean that you're collecting taxes, you're raising revenues, and then you're using most of these taxes and most of this revenue basically only to service the debt. So and this at this time, these countries are faced with a dilemma, which was well expressed in a recent op-ed in the New York Times by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and basically the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said that in 2019, 64 countries, about half of them in sub-Saharan Africa, spent more on servicing external debt than on healthcare. And this was before the pandemic. And now you have the pandemic, and what the Prime Minister says that we are facing a stark dilemma. Should we continue to service our debt, or should we redirect some of these resources to save lives and livelihood? So that's what I want to talk about today. So the crisis hit the world, and very soon the heads of the Bretton Woods institution, the heads of the International Monetary Fund, and the head of the World Bank called for debt relief for the poorest countries. This call by Ms. Georgieva and Mr. Malpass was taken on board by the G20, by the Group of 20, and on April 15, the Group of 20, which is the group of the 20 largest economies, some of them are advanced economies, some of them are developing countries. So G20 includes India, it includes China, it includes Argentina, Indonesia, and of course it also includes the United States, Germany, France, the UK, and so on and so forth. So there was this communique issued by the G20. The communique was longer than this, but I picked a few parts of this communique, which basically stated we support a time-bound suspension of debt service payments for the poorest countries, and I will define poorest country in a minute. Asking for all bilateral official creditors. So what are bilateral official creditors? A bilateral creditor is when a country lends to another country. So a loan from France to Senegal would be a bilateral loan. So asking the suspension of all bilateral, the service of all bilateral loan, and also calling on all private creditors working through their umbrella organization, which is the Institute of International Finance, to participate in this initiative on comparable terms. So the crisis hit the world. There was an immediate call by the heads of the World Bank and the IMF. This call was picked up by the G20, and the G20 said, we rich countries are agreeing on suspending repayments on the money in which that developing countries owe us. And we're also calling private lenders to do the same. So that's the first action. To this, there was a reaction of the Institute of International Finance. So again, this organization of global lenders or global private lenders. And the first reaction, which actually came before the communique, because this communique, by the time it was formalized, people knew more or less the text and knew what it would come out. So even before the communique, the Institute for International Finance issued a letter, which was very much along the lines of the call for a suspension of payments by private creditors. So it said, we urge international coordination whenever possible, and that said, sovereign issuers should treat everybody the same. No creditor or creditor group should be excluded ex ante from participating in that restructuring. Broad creditor participation in that restructuring will support fair burden sharing. So actually, this was nice because most people reading of this communique by the IIF was that yes, will be part of this initiative. This was on April 9. On May 1st, so 20 days after, the IIF came out with another letter, which was much more cautious, and basically said, the situation is complicated. Each country will have to be dealt with in its own way. The participation of private creditor will have to be on a voluntary basis. So it's not that, IIF will negotiate for all the creditors, and once the IIF reaches an agreement, all the private creditors will follow this agreement. Not now. Each country will have to negotiate individually with each creditor, making the negotiation very complicated. Each creditor will have to assess in its own way what would be rescheduling of debt with would be what is called NPV, net present value neutral. That it means would decide whether a rescheduling does not make the creditor worse off. So at the end, our reading of this second letter of the Institute of International Finance is that there was no appetite from the private sector to participate in this initiative. So, and this, we found this second reaction rather disappointing. This, I just wanted to give you an idea of what type of money we are talking about. So these are some estimates, and these are our rough estimates on how much countries need to repay to different types of creditor over the next 12 months. And this is only focuses on a part of the debt, focus on debt which was originally issued as long-term debt. So there is also a lot of debt that needs to be repaid, and this is debt that was issued as a form of short-term debt, but we don't have good data for this type of debt. So if we were to add this other type of debt, the numbers will be bigger, but we wanted to be conservative. And let me walk you this. So this is a graph with a lot of bars and a lot of colors. Let me just tell you what the different bars and the different colors are. So here we first have countries defined by geographical origin. So EAP is East Asia and Pacific, ECA is East Europe and Central Asia, LAC is Latin America and the Caribbean, M&A is Middle East and North Africa, SAS is South Asia, and SSA is Sub-Saharan Africa. Here instead we group countries by their level of income. These are low-income countries, so these are the poorest country. These are what they're called lower middle-income countries. So these are countries which are not the poorest, but they're not very rich either. So here you would have countries like Kenya. And here are upper middle-income countries. So these are countries which are still classified as developing countries, but on the upper bracket of income. So here you would have countries like Mexico or Indonesia or Malaysia. And I'll get to this in a minute. So that's the color. So if you look upper middle income countries, this group of countries will have to repay in the next 12 months something like $220 billion. Lower middle income countries about $100 billion, and the lower is like about $10 billion. So let's say a total 220 plus 100, 320, about $330 billion over the next 12 months. Again, these are rough estimations because this type of data are very hard to get. So these are the bars, and here there are different colors. And what you see here, which is sort of blue, this is official lending, which is either bilateral, so it's again would be lending from France to Senegal, or multilateral. So this would be lending by the World Bank or by the African Development Bank or by the Asian Development Bank or by the Inter-American Development Bank and so on and so forth. And what you see, which is red or orange, these are money which are owed to private creditors, either private creditor which are owed money through bonds, this is the red, or private creditors which are owed money through bank loans, and this is the orange. And then there is one more difference. Part of the one that has dots are interest repayment, and what it doesn't have dot, the solid line, is principal repayment, but that's we're getting too complicated. One thing that I would like you to look at this is compare this type of numbers with what the G20 action targeted, which was bilateral lending for a group of low-income countries plus Angola. So the countries targeted by this G20 initiative were countries classified as low income plus one country, which is Angola. And this is the amount involved. So it's $14 billion. Now, $14 billion is a lot of money, but when you compare this amount, this $14 billion with this type of amounts, you realize that this is a relatively small effort. So that was to give you a feeling of what type of problem we're talking about. There is also a graph here. I will not spend much time on this, but this is a country by country graph, which only focuses on external interest payment. So there is no principal here, just the interest, and it presents country by country data. So in the case of Egypt, as you see, about a little bit more than 1 billion is owed to the multilateral. So this would be the World Bank and the African Development Bank. A very little to bilateral. So this would be loans with other countries. and then about 1.5 billion, which is owed to private creditor. This is the case for Angola, and here you see other countries. Okay, so in this situation, the group of authors I mentioned before, Patrick Bolton, Lee Bucay, Pierre-Olivier Gorinchas, Mitu Gulati, Changtai She, Beatrice Vedder, and I prepared a proposal to facilitate a debt standstill for countries who would need such a standstill, so that countries would not to face the dilemma explained by the Ethiopian Prime Minister. And our proposal included a carrot and a stick. So I'm going to go through the carrot, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the stick. So here I have two slides, so the carrot is what we call the central credit facility. And I have two slides that explain this central credit facility, but instead of going through the words, let me try to explain this with a picture. It's a complicated picture, it has a lot of lines, but let me go line by line. So now you have a sovereign debtor, so you have a country which owes money to a bunch of people. Some of them are bilateral, some of them are commercial, so they're private sector. So let's suppose that this country is Angola, one of the countries targeted by the G20 initiative. So Angola owes some money, and we know exactly, you see, here it's Angola. It owes this amount of money to multilateral. We will not consider multilateral for the moment. If you want, we can come back to this in the Q&A session. It owes some to bilateral, and it owes this to private creditor. So let's suppose this is Angola. And these are the people who lent the money to Angola. So the bilateral and the commercial creditor. So Angola, it's supposed to pay this money, this interest, to the people who lent money to Angola. And our proposal says, don't pay this money. But it doesn't just say don't pay this money. Say, take this money, put them in what we call the CCF, the Central Credit Facility. And what is the CCF doing with this money? Is going to lend them back to Angola. So de facto, Angola did not repay the money, because the money goes out here and goes back to Angola immediately. So you might wonder, so why I need this stuff with all these arrows I could have just said, Angola, don't pay. But here is where the thing become interesting, is that this central credit facility is supervised by a third party, which does two things. It monitors the use of funds. So it monitors that Angola is indeed using this money, which has not been repaid, for COVID-19 amelioration, and not to, buy a private plane for the president. That's the first thing. So there is a monitoring rule. And the second thing, after the crisis is over, Angola will repay the Central Credit Facility, and the Central Credit Facility will repay the bilateral commercial creditor. Why is this a carrot for the bilateral, for the commercial creditor? Is that in our model, the MDB will also put some money in the Central Credit Facility, what we call commingling. So when the sovereign debtor needs to pay the Central Credit Facility, it needs to pay to an entity which is partly owned by private people and partly owned by a multilateral development bank. And multilateral development banks tend to have a degree of implicit seniority. They always get paid. So by mixing this loan of private creditor with the loan with the MDB, in a certain sense, this money gets a higher degree of protection, and it increases the likelihood that the commercial creditor will be repaid. So that was the incentive, was the carrot in our plan. We tell the commercial creditor, you're not going to get your money now, but we're going to park your money in a fund which has more safety than the traditional commercial lending. So what we call here, we give them a halo of preferred creditor status. So that was our proposal. I mean, if you want to read more, we have a longish paper with a lot of details on how this should be implemented. So this was the carrot part of our proposal, but our proposal had also had a stick part. So suppose that a creditor didn't want to participate in this scheme, and one thing that that you should know, that sovereign debt contracts are very complicated contracts and have one characteristics which does not exist in private credit contracts, is that contracts are don't have a well-defined bankruptcy regime, which instead it exists for commercial credits. And so there is this this doctrine in international laws that countries have an obligation to repay. So this is, it's the Latin thing, pacta sunt servanda. So I have to respect my commitment. However, in international law, there is a doctrine, there is a recognized doctrine, which is recognized in Article 25 of whatever. So that's why when you have to do this, you cannot do this only among economists. You need lawyers to do that, and we have very good lawyers in our group. And this doctrine, which is called the doctrine of necessity, states that a country can declare a state of necessity, can declare that it's not following its international obligations because it's basically because following this international obligation would hurt the country. So it's necessary not to follow the international obligation. And so the carrot, the stick in our proposal would be that the G20 would support developing countries in declaring the state of necessity, so that private creditors could not sue countries who would not repay their international debt in international courts, because they would be doing so following this doctrine of the state of necessity. So that was that's the second part. Now, what happened after all this is that market participants started saying, we no longer have a problem. So here I put a famous quote by Candide, by Voltaire. And so if you have read Candide, you know that here there was Dr. Pangloss, which had this philosophy, which was, we live in the best possible world, and in this best possible world, everything is perfect and nothing is going wrong. So why are we worrying? And this so what is related to the fact that at the beginning of the crisis, there was what economists call a sudden stop. So developing countries lost their ability to borrow in international capital markets. And so this is very bad, because you have a massive crisis that's hitting you. You have to repay your debt. And not only you have to repay your debt, but nobody is lending new money. So money is only going out, it's not coming in. And you have people dying. And that's a very difficult situation. The situation would be different if people say, okay, you're repaying all that, but I'm going to lend you new money. So, new money is coming in, so it's not a big issue. And so the people who said, so what, say, look at what happened. And here I'm going to show you 3 graphs, which I quote unquote borrowed. I stole from my friend Jeremy Zettelmeyer, which show this what has happened since the beginning of the crisis. So one measure of the ability of accessing international capital markets is what interest rate are people willing to lend you money. And so this graph, let's focus on the blue line. So this graph shows the type of interest rate that developing countries were paying on average. So this bunch is an average for a bunch of countries in the international market. So you see that before the crisis, they were borrowing on average at about 4.5%. Then the crisis hit, and there was what we call this sudden stop. Nobody was willing to lend. So if nobody's willing to lend, it's equivalent that, I'm going to lend you just if you pay me a lot of money. So this yield went from 4.5% to 8%, which is very high. But then something surprising, at least surprising to me and to many other people, happened. This sudden stop didn't last very long. And as you can see, these yields have been going down. They're not as low as they were before the crisis, but they went down a lot. So people say, where is the problem? So I show you this, which is a graph in terms of prices. You see the same thing if you look in terms of quantities. These sort of yellow areas show how many sovereign bonds in billions of dollars country were issuing over a given 12 months period. And this is the minimum and the maximum between 2008 and 2019. So this upper bound is the maximum over the previous 10 years. And look, so far, we surpassed the maximum. So again, people say, what's the problem? So you have people who want to borrow can borrow. Now, this is true on average, but this is not the case for every country. So this is the number of countries which did not have access to the international capital market. Before the crisis, there were 8 countries, 2 low-income countries and 2 middle-income countries, which didn't have access to the international capital markets. So here you would have, among emerging markets, you would have countries like Argentina, Ecuador, Lebanon. In low-income countries, I don't know which this country were. Then the crisis hit, and this number increased dramatically. So we went to 26 emerging markets and 8 low-income countries. So we went to from 8 to 34 countries with no access. But then again, many countries regained access. We are still in a worse situation, much worse than before the crisis. So now we have about 17 countries with no market access, but many recovered market access with some exception. So the Panglossian people say, okay, why are you worried? Maybe let's focus a little bit on this small number of countries, but on average things are not going so badly. So let me conclude. So I said I would speak for 40 minutes. So I have one more slide and I'll conclude. The so what is that, now conditions are fragile, are good, but these favorable conditions are very fragile. And many countries are now facing solvency problems. So that is, it's not a liquidity issue that I need the money as nobody's willing to lend me the money, but it's more a solvency issue that when it will be time to pay, I will not have the money to pay, and so I will go through a massive debt crisis. And when this thing happens, there will be a sort of possibility, debt restructuring, high inflation, capital controls, financial repression, a mix of these three. So I'm following closely the situation of Lebanon, and Lebanon actually has all three of them and more. together. They're all unpleasant, and we should get ready for this unpleasant situation. So let me close here. So I put here a bunch of all what I told you is based on a series of articles which were written with Patrick Bolton and the other people I mentioned before. I haven't talked about the problem of odious debt, but here also put two links to the odious debt problem. So, but let me close here, and I'll take questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. And I think it's really a great proposal. And we are going to now open the floor for questions from the audience. And I do have a first question, which I would like to pose to you. So this proposal is really great for developing countries struggling in this period. But are we sure that we would like to benefit all developing countries without any distinction? So what if a country is run by an authoritarian government and may use this debt service relief to reinforce its non-democratic position and actions?
So, I mean, this is somewhat related to the question of odious debt. If you want, we can link to it. But I'm not too worried about it, because dictators and authoritarian regimes traditionally have actually prioritized that payment, because they care more about their international reputation than their reputation within the country, again, with some exceptions. If you read the history of Romania, for instance, people in Romania were starving, and Ceausescu was very proud of being always current on repaying his international debt. And he would have considered, because he would have considered not repaying his international debt as a sign that he was a sign with international counterparts that he was not a good leader, while he didn't really care about the fact that people in Romania were starving. So, you know, there are always problems with all proposals, but I don't see this as a big issue, because again, if you look at history, dictators always try to repay their debt. What we should do, we should prevent dictators from borrowing. That's the big issue, and that's the issue which is linked to the odious debt problem.
Okay, there is one more question from the YouTube Q&A. And the person is asking whether your proposal is similar to create a new bank that could concentrate all credits for the countries, and how could the CCF diversify the risk of lower income countries?
No, our proposal is not about creating a new bank. Our proposal is simply about creating what is called a special purpose vehicle, so like a box. We would be managed by an existing institution. Ideally, in our proposal, would be managed by the World Bank, but it could also be managed by you know, any of the others multilateral development banks. Just the World Bank is bigger and has global reach. And there would be you know, there would be no additional diversification, in the sense that you know, if I had a debt, if I had a loan with Angola, my repayment from the CCF will be linked to Angola's repayment, and not to the average payment of all the countries which owe money to the CCF.
Still on mute. Thank you very much, Hugo, for your answer. There is another question about Mexico, and he's asking, what do you think it will happen in the next 12 months with developing countries, economies like Mexico?
I mean,
what is your view?
So, as I said, so it's hard to make comments which are specific to any specific country. Mexico is being hit by several large shocks. So Mexico is an oil producer. Price of oils are very low. So Mexico is suffering to that. Mexico is very closely linked to the U.S. economy, and the U.S. economy is not doing very well. So it's suffering from that also. But let me go to the more general question of developing countries. So my impression, and this was in the last slide, that many developing countries, so there is this generalized contractions. We can look at country by country forecast, but there's a generalized contraction for all countries. And our impression is that many countries 12 to 24 months down the road will be unable to service their debts, and they will have to restructure their debt. The problem that at this stage is incredibly hard to know which countries will be able to service their debt and which country they won't, because there is massive uncertainty. So the IMF usually produces forecasts for the next 4 years, but now the uncertainty is so large that even the IMF is producing forecasts for just 12 months ahead. So the idea of our proposal was so I'm sure we have many Italians here, what in Italian we call it a bocce ferme. So, you cannot, if you're playing bocce, you cannot decide who is scoring a point when the bocce are still rolling. So now everything is still rolling. So we don't know which countries will be able to service their debt, which countries will have to restructure. And the idea of our proposal is like, let's stop everything. Let's block all repayments now. And 12 months down the road, when we will have more information, we'll be able to decide who can repay. And then who can repay, it's fine. These people will get their money back. And those who cannot repay will go through a debt restructuring process. But at this stage, we risk to push country into a debt crisis, country that would be able to repay once the situation stabilizes. The problem that we simply don't know. Okay,
thank you, Hugo. And there is also a follow-up question on the one before from YouTube. And he's asking whether the credit facility would diversify the risk for lower income countries.
No, again, so there is no real diversification in the CCF. So the only objective of the CCF is, to transfer these loans from one entity to another one. So there is no real diversification there.
Okay, and then Martina Giacomel, who introduced the webinar before, sent me a very interesting question about the role of the private sector in sharing the burden of debt relief. She's basically wondering whether the narrative in which the private sector will join poor countries' debt relief plan is actually a sustainable one. There are several expectations regarding debt repayment moratorium by private creditors, but maybe do they need to be tempered? So, for instance, with also the SDG financing, there is a lot of expectation on PPPs, private-public partnerships, and the role of private sector contribution. And also, what will be the effective role for the private sector in countries where private creditors account for a very small share as in the case of the poorest countries that you mentioned before, that only hold about 10% or even less of sovereign debt?
So if private, if private creditor owns a very small share of that, well, that's by definition, their participation is not very important. But there are poor countries in which the private sector it's an important component. Let me just go back to one slide. So I made a mistake here again. Let me go here, share. So sorry, went too fast. So for instance, Angola is one of the countries included in the G20 initiative. And in the case of Angola, more than 50% of the interest payment due in the next 12 months are due to private creditors. They are high in Zambia, in Ethiopia, so the amount is not very large, but again, if you look at the private creditor, the share is about 50%. In Benin, the share is large. In Rwanda, the share is large. So, clearly, if you have very little of it, it doesn't matter much. But for certain countries, this is a relevant component, so it matters. But then there was also another issue which pushed us to write this, that we see the crisis in low-income country sort of almost like a test for what's going to happen in the next 24 months. And our expectations is that we will have several middle-income countries involved. And when we go into middle-income countries, the share of debt owed to private creditors will be much larger. And so, and the idea that if we could use this standstill as a blueprint for what will happen when the big guys are going to get in trouble, it would be good if the blueprint is well designed from the beginning.
Super. There is now the discussion getting into the live also on the YouTube chat. And there is a person asking, he's finding the information about the private debt very interesting. And he was wondering whether you have looked into which are the main lenders and if there is a regional trend of preferred private lenders or if it is more diverse.
I don't have the data here. So but let me tell you that. Okay, let me make one important point. My dream, and this is something I always say. Bono, the singer of U2 that goes around and hugs kids and give money to poor countries. That's a good thing. I would love to see Bono going around in poor country and hug statisticians. So data on that are very poor quality in general. So there is a limited amount of things that we know. Something I mentioned before, we don't know. First of all, we don't know the structure of short-term debt. And even for long-term debt, we have very cursory information. So at most, what we can do, we can split debt in debt owed to groups of creditor, banks versus bonds, multilateral development banks versus bilateral creditors. But with the type of data that we have available, we don't have much more than that. With the data that we have available, within that, we could look at these patterns, and I showed a little bit before. So if you want, I can share it again. So in this case, you can see. So it's here. You can see that, for instance, in Latin America, there are a lot of bonds. In East Europe and Central Asia, there are less bonds and more bank loans. So there are some patterns, and we could do this split country by country, and the data exists. But you cannot do much more than that.
Okay, and on the same line, there's a question in the Q&A here on Zoom that a lot of sub-Saharan African countries borrow directly from very large and influential developing countries like China and India. And these large loans are usually for major infrastructure projects and are to be put in the context of a strong and long-lasting diplomatic relationship between the two countries. So the question is, why would borrowing countries want to bypass the bilateral lending to use this CCF proposal, and with the risk of jeopardizing their bilateral relationship with the borrower?
Well, so first of all, China was part of the G20 initiative. China was fully on board on doing a standstill on their bilateral loans. And in fact, China, this was not public, but I know something about the internal negotiation. China was very insistent, and then eventually gave up to sort of force countries to also involve private creditors. This didn't happen. So China was on board of this initiative. There is a huge issue with Chinese loans to Sub-Saharan Africa, which is, if that data is not transparent, data on Chinese loans is even less transparent, and that's a big issue. But that's different. But again, China was part of the G20 initiative, so was on board on the standstill of the bilateral loans.
Thank you, Ugo. And coming back to the YouTube chat questions and to the model, to the proposal actually, what would be the consequences if a country stops paying the CCF, or if it uses the money it receives back for other purposes not COVID related?
So if it doesn't pay the CCF, the consequence for the country would be the same as the consequence for a country that doesn't repay its debt. If it, and that's why we like this idea of commingling, in the sense that when you have a debt with the CCF, you also have a debt with the World Bank, or the African Development Bank, whoever is managing the CCF. And and traditionally countries have always repaid their debts with the multilateral. So if they don't repay, they don't repay. I mean, what can you do? The only thing is that normally they repay the multilateral. And again, if they don't use the money for the purposes they're supposed to use the money, I mean, again, there isn't much you can do. Countries are sovereign. But again, institutions like the World Bank and the African Development Bank have in place mechanisms to monitor this. Have these mechanisms always work perfectly? Of course not. But it's better than anything else which is around.
Okay, thank you very much, Ugo. There is one last question from YouTube, as we are already over time. And the person is asking is wondering whether if some countries have hidden lenders which can create a hold-up problem to your scheme. Is there a way to improve debt transparency before applying your proposal?
Debt transparency should always be improved, so that's a no-brainer. So that transparency is a good thing on its own. So it should always be improved. Yeah, so if so there are two issues. One issue is the traditional holdout problem, which does not necessarily require hidden lenders. So, you know, in the case of Argentina is a textbook case of problems with holdouts, the past crisis and probably this coming crisis, the current crisis. But these were not hidden lenders, so we perfectly knew with these guys there, you know, were Elliott Associates and others. But yeah, if they're hidden, that's even more complicated because you don't know who these guys are. So that transparency is always a good thing, and you know, the holdout problem, it's always an issue. So there is some progress have been made to deal with holdout problems, but until we have bankruptcy court for sovereigns, the holdout problem will never be fully solved.
Okay, all right. So with this, we are about to end our webinar, and I thank you, Professor Panizza, for all your enlightening discussion, and for all the participants for posing their question. I will leave the floor back to Martina.
Thanks, Enrico. Yes, we are a bit late, but I didn't dare to interrupt this interesting discussion. Very briefly, thanks a lot to those who joined the webinar. Thanks, Enrico. Thanks a lot, Professor. It was indeed a very interesting presentation. And a very brief reminder, next webinar will be at the end of July, the 29th, with Mariana Mazzucato, Professor in Economics and Innovation at the UCL, University College London. So looking forward to meeting you virtually soon. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and wish you a nice weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.